All right. Well, we're going to get ready to get started here. There are a few housekeeping notes for everybody. If we can keep our cameras turned off, that'll help things kind of function a little bit better. The meeting is going to be recorded tonight. Land values and leases are a question that I typically get in the extension office. We're going to have three amazing speakers tonight talking to us about those things. I do ask that you hold your questions until the end of the presentation. If you want to send me a chat, you can find that option at the bottom of the screen, and you can send me a direct message where I could ask that to the speaker at the end of their presentation. Just for timeline purposes, we're looking like around 30 minutes or so for Robin. Robin Reed, we'll introduce her here in just a second. Then Megan Hughes is going to go for another 30-ish or so minutes. And then we'll have Roger McGowan there to wrap us up there for about the last hour. So that's kind of the general timeline. So Robin is Dr. Robin Reed. She used to be, I think you used to be an ag agent. And so she knows some of the
10
questions.
plus years ago at this point, yes.
So she knows some of the questions that I get. I do spend quite a little bit of time on the phone or emailing Robin to ask her different questions, but she's going to talk to us tonight about land values. And Robin, I'm going to kick it over straight to you and let you kind of run with it.
Yeah, thank you. I'll go ahead and pull my slides up here. I think you'll start seeing them now. And so what I'm going to do, get my screen arranged here. What I'm going to do is just give you kind of a general overview. And I'm probably first going to apologize that we're not there in person. I know you got a little bit of snow down in your area. One thing Ryan probably doesn't know about me, but I grew up in Wisconsin. I started out there for the first 20 plus years of my life and came down to K-State to get my master's degree. And so I can definitively say the blizzard that we got on Sunday is the worst I've ever seen in my life. As far as the snow total here was about 12 inches, and Roger McCowan can talk about Topeka, but I think they got about 18 there. And with that wind, we have drifts between our house and the highway that are at least 6 feet tall. So it's been a wild ride here. But it's been a wild ride looking at the farm economy too. And so I'm going to kind of set the picture for tonight, talking about what's going on in the farm economy, how that's affecting land values. Megan's going to talk about rental rates, and then Roger McCowan will finish us out. But the first thing that I'm going to start out with here is just where we are at today. And I think a lot of you listening are probably very in tune to the things that I'm going to talk about tonight, and especially starting out here. But we're starting a lower cycle in the farm profitability. The agriculture is very cyclical in nature. We've had some really great years here, and now we're just getting to where we are going to have some lower farm income going forward. This is mainly driven by our grain prices. So commodity prices, exception of beef cattle. Beef cattle, I'm not going to talk about much tonight, but just, as you know, prices are historically high. This is really good for the cow-calf producers. They're selling their calves for record prices. But as in your area, I know there's a lot of stocker cattle, Flint Hills area. You got to remember the stocker guys are still buying those cattle and selling those cattle. So higher prices don't always mean higher income. What they do mean is higher risk in what that price could do on the back end when they're buying those stocker animals and then selling them later on. The other thing different today than the last downturn we had in the farm economy is the interest rates. So we're in a higher interest rate environment, even though the Fed has brought that interest rate down a couple times, 1/4%, 0.5% here, but we're still in an environment where it is very costly to finance inputs on a farm and then wait for that income later when you're selling those cattle or selling those crops. So really overall tighter margins, the margin just being the difference between the income and the expenses, and that translates into lower profitability for many of our farms and ranches. I think the most certain thing I can say in my time on this presentation tonight is what lies ahead is a ton of uncertainty. I'm going to talk about a number of different things that are contributing to that, but we're just at a very interesting point in not knowing going forward a lot of issues that we're going to have to be dealing with. So one of those issues is what's driving our crop prices. So again, I think a lot of you know most of what we do on an international scale is competing with Brazil and Argentina. They have been adding tillable acres of cropland for a large amount of time, but has really escalated in recent years. And just a couple of years ago, really, Brazil started to be the largest producer in the world of soybeans and largest exporter of soybeans. The US was the number one producer and exporter of corn and beans for quite a while. Brazil has taken that spot away on the soybean front. So that puts the US in kind of a bad spot. We really rely on that export market for soybean crops. So over 40% of our US soybeans have to go on the export market. We don't have a domestic use for all of our soybeans here. When we're looking at corn, that's only about 15%. So we feed a lot of corn to beef cattle, we make it into ethanol. There's a lot of different uses for our corn crops. So only 15% of that typically ends up on the international market. But for soybeans, the international market is a big deal. And these two countries are just hard to compete with right now. So you couple that with we've just had very large crops here in the US the last couple of years. I know many of you here in Kansas, that's hard to kind of think about because we've had some pretty bad drought the last couple of years here. But you got to think of really Kansas not being the biggest producer of these, even though we do produce a lot. So what's going on in Illinois and Iowa and Indiana, those are really what are driving our US crops. And we had a large crop in 2023. Prices went down. Farmers didn't sell a lot of it. Then 2024 came on, another really good yielding crop year. We stockpiled that on top of 2023. And we're just in the US sitting on a lot of corn and soybeans right now. How it's hard to get that on the international market is the strength of the US dollar compared to other exchanges and tensions with China. So China is the number one importer of soybeans from the US, but they look at Brazil and Argentina to buy that crop typically as tensions are mounting, and really have been kind of rocky with the US for a number of years. So all of these things are contributing to why we're having that downturn in our commodity prices. Now, I have to give a little bit of a policy update because that is kind of my specialty in the department as well, is to look at policy and what's going on and interpret that for farmers and ranchers and landowners. So most of you probably know the Farm Bill from 2018. It actually expired last year. We extended it one more year, or well, it's 2025 now. It's expired 2 years ago. We extended a year, and then we extended it another year. So the incoming administration, this is going to be a big thing that they will be working on this coming year. It expires again in the 30th of September. So hopefully we will have a new farm bill at some point, probably by the end of this year. The other thing that I think is going to be something to really watch is trade. I just talked about how important that is with corn and soybeans. The incoming president, President Trump, has talked pretty hotly about some tariffs that could be put into place. And will the retaliatory be against farmers like it maybe was with the last time that we negotiated with China? So that is something to watch. That could have a large effect, even more on our commodity prices and maybe a downward direction in the short run. But we'll see where that goes. Labor, another thing the incoming administration has talked about is possible deportation of illegal immigrants that are here in the US. Not saying whatever side of that is right or wrong, just for talking about how this affects agriculture, fruit and vegetable production, obviously going to be hit hard if we don't have the labor to do what needs to be done there. But even here in Kansas, our dairies and our feed yards and others that rely on labor, it's going to be a little different going forward. And I think another general thing to say about this incoming administration, we had a very large emphasis on conservation in the last administration and regulations. I do think that will probably swing back the other way with the new administration coming in. One thing I know, we probably do have producers and landowners on this call. This is something that you probably haven't heard of yet. This was passed with the extension of the Farm Bill right before Christmas, so kind of hot off the press here. But there are, instead of negotiating a new Farm Bill, there's a lot of recognition that the old Farm Bill is not providing the support that it needs to, as the economic times in agriculture are being in a downturn. So what this did was actually authorize some direct payments to farmers. And what that calculation ended up being, there's a lot of negotiation, but there's two formulas, and it's going to pay the higher amount of those two formulas. So at the national scale, they're looking at each commodity. So let's use corn as an example. The difference in the expected cost of production per acre for corn, less what the gross return was on it. So the yield times the price. If that's less than the cost of production, the farmer will get a payment which represents 26% of that economic loss. There was also a formula to give a minimum payment per crop, and that was based on Farm Bill reference prices and a national yield. So you don't need to know any of these things other than I'm going to show you what those rates look like here on the next slide. But this is going to pay on planted acres from 2024. Those are already reported to the Farm Service Agency office, so these payments should be fairly seamless and come out pretty quickly. 50%, this is prevent plant acres. So here in Kansas, we don't deal with that much, but if it was too wet to plant and the farmer couldn't get the crop in, they still get a payment that's 50% of the normal rate. So this has a separate payment limit from other programs, and interestingly, if less than 75% of the farmer's income was from farming or ranching, they have a lower limit than an individual or an entity that had more than 75% of their income from farming or ranching. So why I bring this up tonight, it is a big deal for agriculture. That the bill authorized $10 billion to farmers and ranchers that will be paid within 90 days of the act. So 90 days prior to Christmas is when that started. Here in Kansas, that estimate has been $774 million. So this will have an effect on our land market and our rental rates. And I just wanted you to be aware of this will be coming out. So here are the per acre bill that was passed. USDA will do their own calculations. These will likely change a little bit, but we are very close, I am confident. So about $40 an acre for corn, sorghum, soybeans and wheat, more like $30 an acre. And again, this is paid on all of your planted acres from 2024. So my example here, I threw in some acreage, so 600 total planted acres. Each of those are multiplied by that higher payment rate of the two calculations. So this farm would be receiving about $22,000. We have a whole paper and a calculator tool on this link. Ryan is going to be sending these slides out or has access to them. So moving forward, what I was asked to talk about tonight is the land values market. So again, we came off of some really high farm income. We had government payments during COVID to farmers. All of this fueled escalating land prices the last few years. Where we're at right now, I talked about farm profitability being fairly uncertain, interest rates historically high, our agricultural land values at a tipping point. That's kind of my question tonight as we sit here. I think we are probably at that point. So I'm not going to go through some of this too much in detail. This just shows the net farm income or the profitability of farms in the entire United States and where that has been. I will highlight 2020 or 2010 right here to 2014 was our last good years in agriculture. I'll show you that here in Kansas here in a minute. Then we had this downturn in the farm economy. And now we've been up to almost record farm income the last few years, but this is going to be falling quite quickly. And that's why those economic payments were authorized. So let's look at Kansas here more specifically. We have about 1,200 farms that are in our Kansas Farm Management Association, and they work with a trained economist. And so they have basically their finances, their taxes done by a trained economist, and then we summarize that at the state level and use it to look at what's going on in our state. So I highlighted these were the good years in the last agricultural good years, 2010 to 2014. The average farm here in Kansas, obviously there's a huge variation around this, but was making about $150,000, $160,000 per year. That would go to family living expenses, buying land, buying equipment, things like that. So that was the good years in agriculture. This is not inflation adjusted. This drop here was the biggest drop in farm income that we have ever seen in our database. That has gone back well since the 1960s. So we were worried we were going back to a 1980s farm crisis when this happened here. And in reality, we did climb out of this with some government payments due to the trade war in China, due to COVID. And really at the end of 2020, farm incomes really took off. Again, government payments, commodity prices. This year, 2021, that's a new record, even inflation adjusted. The next closest one would be 1973. So $319,000 the average farm had in profitability that year. Since then, you can see that has stair-stepped down. 2024, I would expect to be a little bit lower than this number. And where we go from there is really uncertain. So why I talk about that first is just to show you land values are still very much tied to what's going on in the farm economy. And even though we have other purchasers of land in the market these days, it still tracks very closely with what's going on with ag profitability. And so to illustrate that, I got a few things here that are based on USDA survey numbers. These are released every year at the state level. So the one thing I always say is Eastern Kansas and Western Kansas are night and day difference. So one number for irrigated, dryland, and pasture for the entire state of Kansas tells nothing about any particular land value. But this number has been available, I think, since the 1920s. So it's really interesting to look at the trend in very large periods of time with the state average. So you can see again, the last run up we had in profitability, we had irrigated ground gaining almost 30% of its value every single year for 4 years in a row. Excuse me, non-irrigated 26%, pasture about 18. And then when profitability fell out of agriculture, again, we were worried those would quickly come down. And instead, the market just kind of flattened. And fortunately, we did, as profitability picked up again, we took off again on land values. So you can see recently here what those land value escalations have been. If we really want to go back in time, we'll go through this quick, but it's kind of cool to see. Again, this number is available since a very long time ago. Here's how land values grew during the 1980s and then fell off. And this was the farm crisis right here. Well, compare that to the last two run-ups in land value. There's a huge stark difference and how we thought that might fall here. You can understand just by how steep that came up. Since 1950, land values have grown about 5.3%. Now, obviously, inflation has made a big difference. So if we adjust for inflation, the 1980s get a lot larger, look a lot more like a bubble here. Excuse me. But as we get to recent years, those are still pretty quick escalations. I'm going to get a drink here just a minute. If there's any questions, Ryan, go ahead and have them type them in the chat.
Does anybody have any questions for Robin thus far through her presentation? I guess I'll go back in and just reintroduce myself. Really didn't do a very good job of that. I'm Ryan Schaub, and I'm the Frontier Extension District farm management and crop production agent. Again, I'm like Robin. I want to apologize for this not being an in-person meeting. Weather just wasn't cooperating for us, trying to get everybody down. But with that being said, I should have said that at the beginning, and I'll say it, just 15 minutes into the presentation. So Robin looks like she's ready to get back into it. So we'll let her go.
I apologize. I've been recovering from a pretty nasty cold here too. So, all right. So let's end here with what you probably want if you're really wanting to study land values. This is the resource that you want to look at. We just published this right before Christmas. So instead of being survey data, this is actually all the land sales that occurred in Kansas in 2024. We work with the Property Valuation Department and Society of Farm Managers and Rural Appraisers to get this information, summarize it, and publish it into an annual book. So again, at the state level, it was about like I would expect. It varies by region, but both cropland and pasture are up a little bit from last year, but not up near as much as what we've escalated in recent years. Irrigated cropland is the one that continues to really climb the most. Now, I asked most of you what county you were from as you came on tonight. So I'm going to just highlight the eastern side of the state. Know that every county in Kansas is represented in the book, and there's 9 different crop reporting districts, so 9 regions of Kansas. So if I don't talk about Western Kansas tonight, I think one individual was interested, that is in the book. So what we're seeing in the eastern side of the state, really our cropland values continue to climb. This northeast region is always in a league of its own with land values. So up in this region, the average now is approaching 7,500 an acre. There's a lot of land in Brown, Donovan, even Atchison County that you'll see over 10,000 quite easily. And that continues to grow as we head into 2024, or as we wrap up 2024. Where most of you are from here in East Central and Southeast Kansas, really land values on non-irrigated crop ground grew some, both in those regions, about $4,500 an acre on average. If we look, excuse me, pasture and hay ground, again, across the board, land values are still going up. There was a little blip here. I made a note. We just didn't have a lot of grass sales in these high value counties last year, but I would expect the rate was probably higher on average there. But across the board, we are up, but again, not as much as recent years. So here's the information that the book really highlights and why it's one of the biggest resources that we have out of our department each year. And that again gives by county the minimum, the maximum, and the average sale that occurred in 2024. So I know some of you said you were from Anderson here. So you can see the minimum, maximum, average on non-irrigated crop ground, pasture and hay ground. There's a lot more sales, so a lot bigger variation there, but the average being about $3,300, $3,400 per acre. As you look down at the other counties, some of them always stand out. Douglas, Miami, we're getting a lot in this region that are just urban counties, and it's really hard to differentiate ag use versus future development potential. So some of these sales that look like outliers, we actually determine not. There's just a very big distribution of the amount that those sales went for. I will say some of the outliers that we dropped out of these were quite a bit higher than the values we're even reporting. But all of these counties, again, are in the book. You can look at just the range that has happened and the average value. And to have a county in here, you'll notice some of them are missing. This list is a little larger than this one. We have to have at least 3 sales that were 75% non-irrigated versus pasture. We call those more Puritan parcels. Otherwise, we just can't report value. Some of you I know are from the southeast region of Kansas, so some counties in there that I saw when we got on. So Allen County are at the top there, minimum, maximum, average about 5,300 an acre on non-irrigated crop ground, about 2,800 on pasture and hay ground. But again, there's a lot of variation in minimum and maximum sales. So I know my time here, my first 30 minutes is wrapping up, but again, this information is on our website, agmanager.info. I'll get to that at my last slide. But I would encourage you to go on to look at your county values. And even if you're not thinking about selling, it's really good just to know where the market is at as well as this, because does affect your balance sheet when you're looking for financing too for your farm or ranch. So I'm going to end with some thoughts of where we go from here, and then we'll open up for questions. Really, when I talked about land values being at a tipping point, I think the number one thing is how long will lower farm profitability persist? The last downturn, we were in it for 5 years. And as you saw, land values stabilized, came down a little bit in some areas, but we were able to make it through 5 years with fairly low profitability. Will the economic relief payments be enough to support land values? So again, last time we had marketing facilitation payments, we had coronavirus food assistance payments. So will payments to farmers in lieu of trade negotiations and things like that, will that be enough to support the land values? We'll see there. Cattle prices again, I think we're going to be in it for quite a while in these higher prices, which will support our pasture values and in turn support our cropland values. We just have a very small beef cattle herd in the US. And in order to grow that herd, we need to retain heifers to become breeding cows. And so far, we're just not seeing that happen. So when we start seeing that happen, it's really another year or two down the road before those heifers come into production. So I think that will add strength to the market. And then the number one thing really in my area that I see firsthand is just what the hunting, recreational, and investment interest is in agriculture. And I think here the general economy remains strong. So there's money for other individuals other than farmers to invest into land. And then investors as well. We saw a lot of interest when the stock market was not doing so well and just diversifying our portfolio. Right now, stock market is going quite lucratively, but will investors still be using land to diversify a portfolio? So all of these things are things to be watching on the horizon. Here's a website again, agmanager.info. What I talked about in land values, if you go under farm management, there's a land buying and valuing section. That is where the 2024 land values book would be. We're getting professionally printed copies right now, and those will be out in our extension office. This is in all 105 counties here in a few weeks. So with that, Ryan, I'm going to go ahead and open it up for questions.
Yeah, there was a couple questions in the chat. I think Roger has started to address those, Robin. One of the questions was, will the emergency farm payments be paid on base acres or what was planted?
Yeah, and it will be actually planted acres. That's a good clarification there. Yeah, historically, we've always used base acres for farm payments, but this will be on planted acres in 2024.
And I think as Roger stated in the chat, also prevented plant acres. How will that be addressed?
That's 50%. So if you intended to plant 100 acres of corn, you only got 50 in the ground, you'll get the full payment on those 50 acres and you will get half the payment on the other 50 that you couldn't plant, that were prevented from planting. So, yep.
The other question that I seen that was asked was a graphic for the Northeast. I guess in relation to that, you can find it on Ag Manager, but I'll also,
I'm
after
assuming
the
this is what
meeting,
they're talking about, maybe.
yeah, that graphic.
I did have Northeast in here, but yeah, these county level values are in the book, along with every other county in Kansas that I was able to have at least 3 good sales to summarize.
And I will try to send that out to all the email addresses that I've gotten. So when I send whatever I sent the link out to, I'll share a link to the book that's on Ag Manager as well, so that you can flip through and find Northeast as well. So, are there any other questions? I guess that's a time right now that if you have questions for Robin, you can unmute yourself and actually ask her directly, or you can put it in the chat, but we'll give it a few minutes here.
And Ryan, we could go ahead and have Megan go too, and then I was gonna hang on and do questions with her as well. She's
Yeah.
new to our department in the last year, so I was gonna stay on and help her as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. If we want to go ahead and start getting Megan's slides put up, we can do that. I know that I get a lot of questions on rental rates, and what I guess I'm going to just go ahead and say what I hear in the county differs quite a little bit sometimes from what is reported by USDA reports and stuff like that. I guess all I can tell you guys is what I'm hearing, what we have in writing, and you guys need to negotiate those things and kind of find that middle ground with each other. And I heard it best one time stated as, you can own, when you're renting ground to somebody, that's a business, and you only do business with people that you trust. So if you don't trust somebody, I guess maybe you back out of that and you find somebody that you can trust and that you can work with. So I guess I'm going to let Megan come in and introduce herself. Is this her first? I don't know if this is Megan's first presentation or not since she's been on board, but.
Did an agent update, but this is my first county meeting, so I'm so excited. Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you for joining us.
All right. So my name is Megan Hughes, and as Robin mentioned, I joined the Department of Agricultural Economics in September. So my position, I'm an extension specialist, 80% extension, 20% research, and my area of focus is land markets and crop markets. So I'm working on building up a little bit more of a program here. And I also want to echo the apology for not being there in person, but I hope I get to meet a lot of you in person moving forward. So I'm going to start my talk with some best practices in negotiating in agriculture. Maybe. Can I? Okay, perfect. Broadly, what is a negotiation? So many of you have been involved in a negotiation. In fact, I'd be surprised if all of you have not. But we'll just give it a formal definition here, which is when two or more parties with different interests come together to reach a mutually acceptable agreement. So a negotiation can be considered a form of conflict resolution. And what I have for you here is what we call the conflict continuum. So you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, we start with avoidance, negotiation, and then mediation. Avoidance being not addressing our problem at all, negotiation being working directly with the other party to solve it, mediation bringing in a mediator. As opposed to the right-hand side of this continuum, which are considered methods for conflict resolution that have a little bit higher of a cost, and you lose control over the outcome a little more. So you've got arbitration, litigation, and then self-help, which would be unilaterally taking a decision and taking action on your own. So the further we go to the right, the less control we have over the outcome and the higher the cost of resolution. The further we go to the left, the lower cost to resolution and the more control over the outcome by parties. So we can see that as being a little more favorable in certain circumstances. So why negotiate? Well, we've got two parties with a different set of resources. You might be a landowner who has land needed for production, and you might be a producer with the knowledge and other capital requirements. So bringing these two parties together creates value. And so through negotiation, we're going to distribute this value amongst each party. A well-negotiated lease is really important, right? It sets the foundation for a successful landlord-tenant relationship, protects the interest of both parties, and can reduce the potential for disputes and legal issues down the line. So really, in a well-negotiated lease, we're thinking, are both sides protected? Are the relevant issues covered? Are any contingencies addressed? And if not, we might be pushed from the left-hand side of that conflict continuum over to the right-hand side, which has the potential to be really expensive and time-consuming for all parties. So it's great to just start with our bases covered. Thinking about preparing for a negotiation, I want to introduce a new kind of framework. So this is going to be an alternative to a price-centric framework, which is basically focusing on what price am I paying for this piece of land, which can lead to a more adversarial or winner-loser mentality between negotiating parties rather than a collaborative one. So here we're going to consider the rights, responsibilities, risks, and rewards that are allocated to each party through the negotiation. So some examples of rights might be the right to specify farming practices, the right to enter the property, right of the landlord to enter the property, hunting rights, and in very specific cases, perhaps a purchase option or a right of first refusal, should we get there. Responsibilities could include now, if you happen to be on irrigated land, winterizing that irrigation system, property management decisions, who's paying for maintenance, major repairs, capital improvements, power, water, etc. would all fall under the responsibilities category. Risks, we all know that we are in a bit of a risky business here. So some examples might be unexpected repairs or drought conditions. And then finally, rewards. So you might have a windfall profit from a bumper crop or higher commodity prices, an increase to the property value from good stewardship or improvements during the lease, or even positive conservation outcomes. So if we think about using this framework to allocate those, it can help us figure out what price we need to be landing on based on who's taking on rights, who's taking on responsibilities, who's taking on risk, who's taking on rewards. As you're walking into a negotiation, the first thing that you need to do is to understand yourself. So you need to define what success looks like for yourself in that negotiation. What are your interests? What are those needs, desires, or concerns that you need addressed out of your agreement? Determine your BATNA, or the best alternative to a negotiated agreement, which can help you to determine what your walkaway point might be from that negotiation. And finally, you need to identify the major issues that are related to your goals. So what issues need to be decided and how do they relate to your interests? And then this, again, will help you determine what the bargaining mix is, which is the suite of issues that are going to be negotiated in this discussion. As much as you need to understand yourself, you also need to understand the other parties involved. So what might their interests be? What are some options that might satisfy both their interests and yours? Think about what their BATNA is. What's their best alternative to the negotiated agreement? And then finally, think about some counterparty due diligence. Like Ryan said, you want to be able to trust the person you're in business with. So you want to think about their ability to keep the terms of their lease and also their willingness to keep the terms of the lease. Another thing to consider might be property due diligence. If you're not already familiar with the property, an evaluation might be in order just to make very clear and be certain of what you are getting. Think about the context of the negotiation. So think about who should be on your team. Are there any other individuals that you need to bring with you into the negotiating table, or other individuals you need to keep in mind? What resources do they bring? What are their strengths and weaknesses? How can they complement your strengths and weaknesses? Etc. Also, think about who's on the other team. What are their strengths and weaknesses? What do you need to watch out for? And then another thing to consider about who's on the other team is what perceptions they have that might complicate negotiations. So if you're working with an out-of-town landlord who's less familiar with farming practices, they might not understand certain decisions that you need to make, or why you can't do certain things, or why you might not want to do certain things. And this could apply a lot to conservation practices, for example. So a lot of communication with that's going to be handy. Consider other factors like deadlines or time limits for accomplishing the negotiation and getting the agreement in place. Plan the process of your negotiation. You're going to want to make an agenda and agree on what will be negotiated. The agenda should really cover the issues that are important to you and the other party. agree to a location? Are we negotiating in person? You're gonna do it on the phone, whatever works for you. Find a way to track what is agreed to. And I'm gonna recommend the use of a term sheet, which I'll discuss on the following slide. And then also have a contingency in place for if negotiations fail. Are we walking away? Are we circling back in a week? What happens then? So a term sheet is a list of the key terms that were agreed to in your lease. So you can use this to really facilitate negotiation and track the terms of the lease as you're negotiating. And this would be considered non-binding. So some things to perhaps have on your term sheet. We're going to think about the term of the lease, have a clear start and end, which can be a date or an event. So it could be like 2 weeks after harvest or a set date. Think about your rent. You want to know the type and the formula. So are we doing a fixed cash amount? Are we doing a base plus a bonus? Are you doing a crop share? Something else? You want to have that laid out in your term sheet. Along with that, you want to have a clear date set for when rent is due, and you want to outline what happens if rent is late. Is there a penalty? Is there a maximum day late until the lease terminates? You want to have that lined out clearly. Think about the responsibilities of both parties, as we mentioned before. Think about farming practices and then insurance. Who's responsible for holding insurance? Do you need your landowner to hold liability or property insurance that covers any improvements to the land? Have those outlined as well. And then default provisions, which I will talk about a little more specifically on the next slide. But the term sheet can be then converted into a binding lease once you've gotten everything talked about. Now you can walk back and get all the particulars in order. You can take your term sheet to an attorney for the conversion, which would save time and legal costs instead of having an attorney do the whole thing or having them sit down with you through the negotiation. And I'd like you to think of the use of an attorney as almost an insurance policy against having a lease with holes that could result in a very costly mediation or arbitration later on. Default provisions. You need to define what constitutes a default. Notification. How should one side notify the other if they believe there has been a default? Think about the cure period, which is the time allocated to fix the default once both parties are notified. And then remedies. What are the remedies if the default is not timely cured? This could look like the right to terminate the lease, right to damages, right to take the crop. So you want to think about those and have them clearly outlined. Finally, prepare to open your negotiation. So you want to set achievable targets. So what do we need? What might be a stretch? Are there multiple or linked issues that need to be discussed together? When you think about your needs, that helps you figure out what some trade-offs or throwaways could be. So if one issue is very important to you, but not so important to the other party, or vice versa, if an issue is not so important to you, but is important to the other party, you might be able to use that as a throwaway to leverage a better position for yourself. Consider your opening offer. Do you want to shoot pretty straight? Do you want to start off a little lower so you have wiggle room to move upwards? Think about that. And then think about the framing of your message. So what are you going to say and how are you going to say it? And then communication. So strategies, specifically communication strategies. It will be helpful to employ active listening. So some traits of that would be empathy, understanding where the other party's coming from and how they're feeling about their needs. Ask a lot of open-ended questions. So you're not getting a lot of information if you are asking yes or no questions. So if you leave the door open, you're going to get a lot more information about the other party and what's important to them out of this negotiation. So as you're asking open-ended questions, you're going to be able to identify themes. So perhaps you're able to pick up on the fact that land stewardship is really important to your landlord, and you can incorporate that into your lease. Avoid reactive listening. So listen to understand rather than listening to respond. Again, just lightens the interpersonal mood of the negotiation. And finally, focus on interest. So look for overlap that will help you move towards resolution. Again, think about the themes of the other party and how that can help you move towards a successful resolution. And then think about the discussion in terms of a future relationship. Do you want this to be a sustained long-term relationship? If so, you might not want to negotiate as hard as you would with maybe a car salesman that you don't care to buy from again in the future. Some other tips here, communicate as often as necessary and be clear in your communication preferences. As a landlord, do you want someone to check in with you frequently? Do you want them to call, text, email? It's good to be clear on those to avoid miscommunication later. Include a clause in your lease for the mediation of disputes. So when we have a disagreement, if we have a disagreement, we want to be clear on how that's going to be resolved. Don't be afraid to barter for reasonable discounts. If you're taking on additional responsibilities or risk, consider asking for reasonable discounts for that. Have a budget, understand your budget, and potentially share that budget because it might help your counterparty understand where you're coming from and why you need the rates you need. And then finally, just be realistic. Remember, negotiation is about building trust for a successful long-term relationship. And finally, we're going to think about how to assess success at the conclusion of a negotiation. So really, the best measure of success is, did you meet your primary objectives? How does that agreement compare to your BATNA, that best alternative to negotiated agreement? It's not going to be a great sign if you end up with an outcome that is worse than your best alternative to the negotiated agreement. But if you're beating your BATNA, things went pretty well. Think about if both parties are benefiting from the agreement. We talked about how you're coming together to create value. Do we feel like we distributed that value appropriately? And then did the negotiation strengthen or at least maintain the relationship between parties? So that is what I have for you on tips for negotiating your lease. Now I'll give a brief discussion on cash rental rates. So Robin did a really great job discussing the economic conditions driving land values. These are going to be very similar for cash rental rates, so I figured I wouldn't rehash those, as again, she covered that very thoroughly. So I'm just going to give you a brief primer on cash rental rates, and these were generated by my colleague, Dr. Greg Eibendahl, in the department. So he generates forecasts for cash rental rates every year. You can find his report on Ag Manager, and we can share that out if you guys need it. I'll just give you an overview of his work on that. So for his approach, how is he coming up with his numbers? He's using what we're referring to as a tenant's residual method. So he's trying to estimate the break-even cash rents. What can a tenant afford to pay and break even? So he's going to start with an estimate of income. So you're thinking crop yield and prices, government payments, and then subtract out estimated or projected expenses. So there's a big cone of uncertainty, right? We know we can make a pretty good guess about what's going to happen tomorrow, but the further we get ahead of us, that cone just widens and it gets a little bit harder to make a projection. So he's using some long-term projections on what expenses are going to be in the 2025 crop year to come up with his 2025 numbers. Essentially, broadly, break-even rates are expected to drop a lot, and that is primarily driven by the fact that net farm income estimates are projected to be not awesome over the upcoming year. However, the realized rates are probably going to be sticky and not come down as quickly as our net income. So again, Dr. Greg Eibendahl's work here. Also, these are not our recommendation for rates, but you can think of them as a starting point for negotiation because every property is different, every operation is different. Okay. So here's our non-irrigated cash rental rates. So I have the KSU projection and then numbers from NAS. So the way NAS comes up with their numbers is these are a backward-looking survey of producers to figure out what they were paying in that crop year. So this is NASS 2024, and I'm sorry, I should have put that label on there. I did not catch that earlier. But again, you can see that the KSU numbers are floating fairly close, if not a little below, a little above. NASS numbers in the East Central region were trending a little bit down, $67 an acre. This was the Kansas State projection for 2024 versus the NASS 2024. Like Robin, I usually speak to the county that I'm in, so I put little circles there for Anderson County. So we're showing that, KSU was generally projecting numbers above what the NASS realized survey estimates were. So think about that trend a little bit moving over to the 2025. So I have KSU 2024 aligned next to KSU 2025, and you can see that county to county, again, we're looking at rates that are $20 an acre lower than we projected them to be for last year. So again, not an exact estimation, but a good starting point if you're thinking about where you might be. And then finally, I included NASA's 2024 pasture rent, just in case. We don't have great data in certain places, but again, these are floating around like $30 per acre in the East Central region. And those, well, who's to say, as cattle markets go, we might see some fluctuation there as well. All right, that's what I have for you. Thank you so much for having me tonight. I'm really appreciate all of your time in attending this evening.
Megan, I guess I'm going to ask a couple questions right off the bat. Is a way of looking at like the KSU projection numbers, is it what producers can afford to pay? Is that why we've seen that drop $20 from what 2024 to 2025's numbers?
Yeah, so the way that those numbers are put together is by forecasting the break-even amount. So what can farmers pay and have their operation break even? So we're expecting that to drop with net farm income, and so that's why those numbers are looking lower from 2024 to 2025.
My second question, and it's not fair for you to have to answer this, but like, so the NASS numbers compared to, is it Leah? There's somebody at K-State that does not the Bluestem Pasture Report. There was a pasture rental publication. I think it gets turned out every other year, but those numbers from that publication more closely match pasture-wise what I'm hearing compared to what the NASS reports, or in Anderson County, the NASS report obviously was blank there. I guess, well, I'm going to go out and say the NASS numbers haven't changed much since the 10 years ago when I started in extension, but I know that rental rates are not staying flat. They're not changing. So why are we not seeing that reflection in the NASS report?
Yeah, it could be simply sample size for NASS. It could be, again, who's responding to their survey versus who's responding to the KSU one. I mean, you tell me whose survey you might trust a little more. I would lean towards the KSU than the NASS. If you're responding to that survey. Robin, do you have some thoughts?
Yeah, I'll chime in on there too. I know this is being recorded, so we don't want to get maybe as honest as we would have in person. I'll caveat with that. But the difference between those, Ryan, so the ones that we do in the department through Leah Soodle, that information is actually used to calculate the property tax formula. So they have a very good incentive to try to get that as accurate as they can. And not that NASS does not, but NASS is a very routine survey. And producers recognize it when it comes every year, fill it out. The economic incentive for producers is to not say what they're actually paying for their highest or their going market rental rates, because that survey obviously is published, and then a lot of absentee landowners look at that and say, should my rate be going up or something like that. So I don't want to say a lot of producers are not honest on those NAS surveys, but unfortunately, I think there is some bias towards reporting a lower cash rent than they might actually be paying.
Yeah, I guess that has been my thoughts, and I appreciate that. I guess I'm going to open it up. Does anybody else have any questions? Again, it's a perfect opportunity. If you would like to unmute yourself, you can ask questions regarding rental rates. I think Megan did a great job of explaining it's not just getting a cash price or just that's not the only thing to worry about. There's a lot of other things. Something, I guess, the communication aspect she talked about, knowledge. Some of our landowners, maybe they're widowed, maybe they don't have the expertise, or they don't know maybe what had happened on the farm. But those new tenants, or maybe they're past tenants or too, but it may, sharing that knowledge back and forth and just understanding what's going on out there, I think is extremely important. So does anybody else have any comments? Or I don't see anything in the chat, but is there anything else?
I will just give a plug for K-State. We have an agent like Ryan in every county, or if it's a multi-county district of Kansas, and that is a really good person to talk to. We're at the state level talking about things that we think we know pretty much a lot about, but the person that we have in our county office is really our person on the ground as K-State that has that local knowledge as well. So reach out to your county agent. If it's not Ryan, you can see we have one in every county in Kansas.
And thank you, Robin. And with that, Roger, I think we'll roll right over to you. I have actually not had the privilege of meeting Roger yet. I've talked to Roger, sending emails back and forth, but I've not met him in person actually. Roger, we missed out on that due to the weather, so I apologize for that. But Roger's going to talk to us about maybe some things that we haven't thought about when it comes to what to put in a lease agreement. So with that, Roger, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Ryan. I'll get to that. And Megan, congratulations on your first extension meeting. I'm approaching 3,000, and I'll have that in about 2 months. If I don't book any more, it's going to take me about 5 more weeks, and I'll be at 3,000 for my career. That's just on speaking engagements. And I've had 47 states. I have 3 to go, and I want to pick those 3 off. I've got Hawaii and Alaska done. I still have 3 of the 48 contiguous states. Robin was talking about snow. I grew up in the snow belt in Northeast Indiana. That's where my family farms, and we never lacked for moisture. Here you go. Here's a picture I found. I had my brother send this to me. I remember seeing pictures. I knew one of my siblings had them someplace, and this was down the road near our farm, the winter of 76 and 77. Anybody want to take a guess as to how much snow was recorded at our farm that year, that winter, 76, 77? $172 inches. And when we broke for Christmas break, we didn't go back to school until the 3rd of February. We never had one day we could get to town. And we were 6 miles out of town. And when they did open the road, it was with a big payloader. And what would happen was we'd have successive storms pretty much every Saturday and Sunday. And it would take a week to get things cleared. We got to town and got supplies on snowmobiles. And the snow was all over the fences. Cattle just walked out. They were everywhere. We had ear tags, and they just mixed in with everybody else's cattle. And we had snow up to the roofs on barns with the drifts. So we got about 18 inches here at my place, and I was at the office Monday afternoon, Tuesday and Wednesday. I started a class this week with our law students. So we've got an intensive farm tax class and farm estate planning class right now. So that's the one thing about being able to do things online, even though the university hasn't been open yet at all this week. Doesn't matter. You don't need a physical classroom to be able to teach online. So here we are tonight. So I'm glad we were able to do this. But let me talk about lease law in general. And Megan, if you're still on, one that I dealt with today, and I had to have the individual, is it send me scan your lease and send it to me so I can read it, because I couldn't believe what he was telling me was correct. And it had a lease termination clause. This was in writing, and most leases, farmers don't even bother to put it in writing. But this was in, excuse me, this was in writing, and it said that notice to terminate had to be given within 30 days of January 1. So they signed a lease that was for the calendar year. He just got notice on December 23rd. He's asking me if it's effective. And so I had him send it to me so I could read it. But what it said was that termination has to be given, notice of termination has to be given within 30 days of January 1. And I told him, I said, well, that could be December 23rd. That could be January 23rd. Both of those are within 30 days of January 1. Do you understand what you just signed? And he said, oh, I never thought of that. That was a form lease that they pulled off from University of Nebraska Extension. Whoever wrote that needs to be drawn and quartered. That's really bad. And so I told him, I said, well, that clause means nothing. I think we could read that out of the lease. And so then you would default to the oral termination, notice of termination statute, which is at least 30 days prior to March 1. And so I think bottom line, yeah, her notice is effective, but in a really weird way. And I can tell you, in over 3 decades of doing this stuff, I've never seen a clause like that. I can't imagine drafting one that poorly. But you see my point when you say within, what they meant was prior to, 30 days prior to or before January 1, but they said within, which there's two sides of within. It could be in front or behind. So that really created a problem. But what are the issues that come up with leases? Well, a lot of various issues. And since most of the leases are oral, these are the things you want to try and get it right. What about fixtures? Who takes removable fixtures? Now, if there's not a provision in a written lease, that belongs to the tenant. If it's a permanent improvement, on the other hand, that's going to belong to the landlord. Does the landlord have a right of entry? No, unless they reserve it in a written lease. There is no right of entry. That really is upsetting to landlords that don't realize that, and can create problems between the landlord and the tenant, because the landlord, in many instances, would like to hunt their ground. They want to come on the premises. Maybe they have something stored in a building someplace, or whatever the reason is. But you can't do that because you are deemed to be interfering with the tenant's possessory interest, possessory right in that property. So you need to reserve that right in a lease. Of course, lease termination, every state has, well, I shouldn't say every state. Nebraska doesn't have a statute on lease termination. They have common law in Nebraska. But in Kansas, it's 30 days prior to March 1. Other states might be 6 months prior to March 1. So that fixes September September 1 is a pretty important date. But that's going to be dependent on state law. Can you assign the lease? Another provision that depends on state law. In Kansas, the answer is no, unless you have the landlord's consent, or you get that right in writing. Who is to control weeds? That's something else that we need to have a clause in written lease that addresses control of weeds. If that is not specified in a written lease, then that normally would fall on the person in possession of the premises. That would be the tenant's problem. However, or tenant's duty to control noxious weeds. But if we're talking noxious weeds, of course, we have a statute that requires the control of noxious weeds. And if they aren't controlled and the county finds them, they will control them and send the landowner a bill. So ultimately, it kicks back to the landowner, because that's the party of record, that the county has a record in terms of who owns the property. But then that's going to create a problem with the tenant. And so that's something you want to talk out and negotiate with the tenant, and probably specify that it's the tenant's responsibility to control the weeds. And then you negotiate the rent based on that responsibility. Liability for rent in the event of a natural disaster, and usually what people are thinking here, this is so-called an act of God clause. We're thinking weather-related events. But I'll show you a case in a bit where, the disaster was not a weather-related event, and they had allocated in a written lease responsibility for rent payment in such a situation, but had not anticipated what happened. Right of the tenant to harvest the crop if the land is sold or the tenant dies. This one creates a lot of, well, it shouldn't create problems, but I think there's just still not a lot of understanding as to what that rule is. If the land is sold and there's an existing tenant on that property, then absent a written agreement to the contrary, the buyer assumes the lease and has the responsibility to follow state law to properly terminate the tenant. So the lease goes with the land. It's the possessory interest that goes now with the ownership interest. You can't separate the two. And so the buyer takes subject to an existing lease. Another issue related to that is what if there's a growing crop on the land that's now sold? What's the right of the tenant to harvest that crop? Well, I'll show you in a little bit. The states differ on that, and that depends on whether the crop is real estate or whether the crop is personal property. And we get into what's known as the doctrine of emoluments on that. What about the right to harvest a crop that's growing? Uh, you got a growing crop at the time the lease terminates. And with this, we think of fall planted wheat. And of course, the termination statute is March 1. You get notice at least 30 days prior to March 1. Well, you've got that growing wheat crop. Who has the right to harvest that? Well, absent a written lease that has language that deals with it, absent that, then the tenant has the right to harvest that, and the lease will terminate with respect to that wheat ground on the earlier of harvest or August 1 of the next year. So if I get notice, say in December, that my lease is going to be up in March, effective March 1, then that lease, with respect to the wheat ground, would not terminate until I harvest it or August 1, whichever of those days comes first. Now, if there's other ground that's not planted at the time that notice of termination comes in, then that will terminate the possessory interest effective March 1. So that's how that works. Now, you heard some of the economics with respect to leasing. I'll leave you these slides. You have access to the slides, but I'll point out a couple of other things in terms of the way you structure a lease, in terms of whether you want it to be a cash lease or a flex cash lease or a crop share, material participation crop share, non-material participation crop share, or some form of hybrid or guaranteed bushel lease. All of those have to do with how you're allocating risk and return between the parties. How are we going to allocate the risk for the return that I'm getting? Do I want a lower return if it's a cash lease because I don't want the risk? I don't want the risk of low prices. I don't want the risk of low yield. So I don't want to share in the crop. I want cash rent. So I'm shifting risk to the tenant. And a lot of that's going to depend on the relative bargaining power of the parties that are involved in the negotiation. But it also, depending on the type of lease that you have, and there are all types, various types of these leases. That's what I'm pointing out there. But another concern is don't forget about the income tax and the estate planning implications of the type of lease that you might have. For purposes of estate planning, often we need to show, for whatever provision we're going to use in the Internal Revenue Code to get a benefit from the estate planning standpoint, or even on the tax side of things, often we have to have a material participation lease. And that means I'm going to pay Social Security tax on that rental income because I'm materially participating. I am bearing risk of price change. I am bearing risk of production. So on the tax side of things, that means I'm going to have to report that on my return in a place that subjects it to Social Security. Also, that whether I have a material participation lease or not can affect some post-death estate planning techniques, primarily special use valuation of that real estate. And there might also be some problems with respect to an estate leasing farm ground after the tenant dies. And we don't want to have cash leases in those situations. So there are tax benefits that you can lose if you're cash leasing because the IRS does not view cash leasing as being the landlord being in the trader business of farming. Okay, they view that as a rental activity. That has implications on the tax side of things. Plus, if we're in the farm programs and I am a cash rent landlord, then I'm not entitled to any of the government payments because I can't satisfy what's known as the active engagement test. I'm not actively engaged in farming. I'm a mere passive cash rent landlord. And then we get into issues as to what is a cash lease and when is a cash lease really a cash lease in terms of how the FSA views it. And back in 2007, they did put out a notice, and it's in the PL, that's in the PL5 handbook. We're now in the PL6. But if any portion, what they said, if any portion of the rent payment is based on gross revenue, the lease is a share lease, if any payment. But if it's tied to a set amount of production based on future market value that's not associated with specific production, that's a cash lease. And the reason they put this out is you see a lot of unique arrangements that landlords and tenants get into. There may be a bonus payment that comes in at the end of the year. There may be unique type of sharing arrangements, but those are your general principles that guide that. Of course, if I'm a cash rent landlord, then I'm not entitled to any of the government payments on the property. In fact, starting in 2009, then they loosened that up a little bit. They said, well, tenants and their landlords can reach any agreement that they want concerning flexing that cash rent payment, and the lease is still going to be deemed to be a share rent. And that's important to landlords because that means entitlement to a share of the government payments on that property. So you can flex it, come down to the end of the year, pay a bonus, those types of things, and that's not going to convert that necessarily by itself to a cash rent arrangement. There are other farming arrangements that are out there that aren't really lease arrangements. One of those is a custom cutting arrangement. Custom cutters are usually treated as independent contractors, not tenants. So one of the implications of that is that they're not entitled to statutory notice of termination because they're not a tenant. Those are independent contractors that are providing a service. A cropper is also not a tenant if the landlord supplies the land and the inputs and controls the operation of the farm and pays a portion of the crop to the person raising and harvesting the crop. So that individual doesn't have any legally enforceable interest in the crop. It's just a contract right to get paid for their labor. So they don't have any interest in the property that has to be terminated by following state notice of termination, termination notice statutes. Now, a cropper is an employee. They're basically just a wage earner that's hired to produce a crop. So kind of like a custom cutter, but both custom cutters and croppers are not tenants. And where we get into that question is, well, I didn't get notice of termination, so I still get to work on this land. Well, no, you're not entitled to notice of termination. You're just there for your service. And then once your service is done, once you cut that crop, that's it. You're just providing a particular service. So if there's a question as to what the status of a person is, the courts are going to look to the intent of the parties based on facts and circumstances. So if you have a written agreement or you have an oral agreement, the terms of that will control. We also look to the actions of the parties and what is the type of the farming operation and whether possession has been given. Those are all fact-dependent situations. And those are the factors that courts look at if we have a question as to whether we're dealing with a tenant or a cropper or a custom cutter. But a lease is an estate in land for a definite period of time that's fixed in advance. And that's true even if it's an oral lease, because an oral lease has a fixed definite time. It's 1 year. Now, it may renew for another year on the same terms and conditions if notice of terminator is not given effectively, but that's an estate in land for a definite period of time fixed in advance. We either have the time frame as fixed in our written lease, or we have a 1 year time frame if it's an oral lease annually renewable. Okay, so again, in Kansas, these oral ag leases are presumed to be tenancies from year to year, automatically renewing if no notice to terminate is given, because now we're under a state statute, and that's 30 days before March 1. And I get questions on this every year. That means 30 24-hour blocks of time before March 1. So the latest you're going to be able to go is February 29 if we have a leap year. But that's still just 29 days. You got to get another full day in January. So that means, well, we better not wait till that last day of January, although that would work in a leap year. But February usually has 28 days, so you're going to have 2 full days in January, and then you have to give your notice before that. So on the 3rd from the last day of January really is the latest you should go in giving that written notice of termination. Now, here's the one I mentioned a moment ago. How are we allocating natural, who's responsible for rent in the event of a natural disaster. Incredible case. I have this in my treatise. K&M Enterprise against Pennington, Louisiana case back in 2000. These parties, the landowner owned land along and adjacent to the Mississippi River, and it was upland. But what happened was he had leased out ground for the tenant to plant corn on, 406 acres. The tenant did put corn in, and it grew, and then all of it was consumed by deer. Every last ear of corn, shredded the entire 406 acres because there had been a flood and the lowland area was flooded, which had a lot of the food supply for the deer. So they migrated to the upland, found this corn, and boy, they're in heaven. So they're mowing this down. Well, he's supposed to pay his rent out of the crop proceeds. Well, there are no proceeds. So this ends up in court. Is he excused from paying rent, or is he still responsible for paying rent? Well, they had a written lease that said that acts of God, the court said, well, your contract's clear, it's unambiguous, and the tenant assumed acts of God. Now he's saying, well, yeah, that's what we put in the lease, but that's not, we weren't thinking about deer eating the crop. We were thinking about flood, fire, those types of things, natural weather disasters, not deer eating it. The court said, well, yeah, they allocated the risk to you. And you assumed those acts of God. It was God's deer that ate the corn. He made them eat the corn. So you're still responsible. Okay. But he also argued, well, I had talked to grandfather here, the owner, about putting up an electrical fence. And they said, no, that was not included in your responsibility, the landlord's responsibility to give you peaceable possession, which is a requirement of the law. And by the way, you didn't ask him whether you could put up an electric fence until pretty much the corn was gone. Now, I think it's kind of a stupid request because electric fence is not going to keep the deer out. But it was a nice try. But he lost that one. I just used that one as an illustration as to the weird things that, a standard boilerplate lease form, we can't anticipate everything that could possibly occur. Excuse me, I'm dealing with a little bit of sinus stuff too, which makes it tough when you have to speak 3.5 hours a day, and then I've got 6 hours Friday plus another 3.5 tomorrow for class. So apologize for that. Now, I already mentioned this one. The tenant's right of possession. The tenant has the right to possess the property during the term of the lease. The owner can't use the land for their own purpose without getting permission from the tenant. So we need to have a clause in the lease that talks about that if that's an important right that the landlord would want to retain. The tenant is responsible for the lease premises because they have possession. This is property law 101. So I can't emphasize this enough. What you have as the tenant is you have an interest in the real estate, but it's not ownership, it's possession. So you're responsible for the stuff associated with somebody that's got possession of the property. And that would mean fences. So if you're putting livestock out there on this leased ground, you're the one that's responsible for maintaining the fences and that keep those animals in. We're a fence-in jurisdiction in Kansas. So you're the one that's responsible for that. Now, the Reynolds case in 2002, if this were a fence law discussion, we'd really get into the Reynolds case. This is a case that arose south of Kansas City. It was Miami County back in 2002. This was on the 4-lane part. Now, all of that's 4-lane now. I just was on that last month when I went down to Pittsburgh to do a seminar. But it didn't used to be. But this was on the 4-lane, 2 southbound lanes, 2 northbound lanes going out of Kansas City, and then back up to Kansas City for about it used to be about 20 or 30 miles from Kansas City metro area, and then it was 2-way. But this was on the 4-lane part. And what happened was on the west side of the highway, you had cattle that were leased. That ground was leased for the tenant to put his cattle on there. And on the east side of the 4-lane, there was an orchard and a highway fence, a dilapidated highway fence that KDOT had not maintained. Well, what happened was there were double box culverts on both sides, and there was when you have these double box culverts, they get fenced around those, but there's always a gap. Sometimes cattle can squeeze through those gaps if it's not properly done. And that's what happened in this situation. The cattle got into those double box culverts, walked all the way underneath the road, underneath the median, underneath the other lanes, came up on the other side in that orchard. And there was no fence that was going to hold them there. That highway fence it was there, but it had never been maintained in terms of cattle type status. And the cows got out on the highway. Reynolds, there was a family in a car, and they hit one of the cows, and unfortunately, one of the persons died. So this is a wrongful death action back against the landowner on the west side, his tenant, and the Kansas Department of Transportation. Now, landlord was the first one out of the case, so he was removed. He doesn't have any liability. And then it came down to the tenant and the Department of Transportation. Well, the tenant's got an issue here, potentially, because it's his cows that got out. He settled. I'm not sure he should have, but he went ahead and settled after that. I'm not sure he should have, looking at it in hindsight. And so now the question was, does the Kansas Department of Transportation owe anything on this wrongful death claim? And the trial court said no, but that got reversed on appeal. The rule on that is that the Department of Transportation has to maintain their highway fences in a manner that would keep livestock off the highway. It's not just to restrict vehicular access, which is what their argument was. Well, we only need something in the way that would prevent an automobile from entering a highway at any given point. So we're just trying to restrict where the roads are at. That's not how the court came out on this. This was a judgment in the seven-figure realm. Okay. On this issue of the tenant's rights to harvest crops, what if the land is sold or the tenant dies before the crop is harvested? Okay. If the crop is growing at the time the lease terminates, the tenant's going to get the crop, but the termination was not the tenant's fault. Now, we can have situations where tenant is terminated because of something bad they did that violated the terms of the lease. Well, if you do that, if it's your fault as to the reason why the lease terminated, then you can't harvest the crop that you already planted. But on all these situations, you can have a written lease that specifies otherwise. And that's a key point on all these things I'll talk about. This goes to how you build that contract. What do you want in there? You can put whatever you want in there as long as the other party agrees to it. But you have to be careful with the written language if you're going to try to specify otherwise. Now, this is an issue here where the tenant is the one that actually terminated the lease. And so the doctrine of emoluments, the right to an away-going crop, didn't apply. Here, the defendant, Battaglia, was a Christmas tree farmer that operated a leased Christmas tree farm. He failed to make the lease payments, but the landlord didn't boot him out, which you have a right to. That we have a statutory procedure for that in Kansas that says that you can terminate the lease for failure to pay rent. Now, there's a time to cure that the tenant has. You just can't say, "Oh, you're a day late, you're out." No, there's a period of time at which you got to give them notice, and then they got a right to pay the rent. And if they do that within the time frame specified by statute, then they get to continue the lease. Here, the defendant was late on his lease payments. The landlord didn't do anything about it, just lets him go. So you got a third party, the plaintiff, Taggart, that comes in and buys the farm from the landlord's estate. And the existing tenant said, "Well, I'll give you a quick claim deed," meaning whatever interest I have in this, you get. Well, he's got a possessory interest as the tenant, so he's giving that up. Well, next Christmas season rolls around. This crop is still growing. This is a Christmas tree farm. So it's not a perennial crop. So that crop is still in the ground a year later, crop, so to speak. It takes a number of years to mature. So he comes in and finds, oh, I've got mature trees now. He cuts 200 trees. And he's trying to argue. Of course, he gets sued. Can you imagine being the landowner? You come home and you look at your place and, oh, my goodness, the landscape is totally different. I've lost 200 trees. And the question is, well, is this an embezzlement? Did he have a right to do this? Lease was terminated while he had a crop in the ground. Can he come in and cut those trees? And the answer to that's no. He could not do that in that instance because he's the one that terminated the lease. He's the one that executed the quitclaim deed. And so there's no application of the doctrine of embezzlement in that situation. Okay. Plus, when he executed that deed, he also conveyed the growing crop to the buyer. Okay. What happens then if you have an oral lease? And again, another thing that needs to be specified in a written lease. What happens if either the tenant or the landlord dies during the term of the lease? And you didn't have a written lease to control this. So this would be the oral situation. Well, if the landlord dies, then the landlord's heirs just assume the lease, and the landlord's heirs have the responsibility to follow state law to terminate the tenant if that's what they want to do. So that one's easy. The heirs just step into the shoes of their deceased family member, and they have the rights and responsibilities that their deceased family member had. But what if the tenant dies? Is the lease over when the tenant dies? Again, we're assuming we don't have anything in writing, which is what most people do. And let me show you some cases on this where the courts will say in this situation, well, maybe that lease is a personal services contract. In other words, I wanted Megan or Robin to farm my ground for me because I think they're a good farmer. And now they died. My tenant died. Well, in Ames against Saylor, the parties entered into an oral lease of farmland, and after 20 years, the tenant died. So this was 20 consecutive one-year leases, just kept rolling over on the same terms and conditions. And then the tenant dies. Well, the heirs of the tenant want to come in. There's a growing crop in the field, and he died. Megan, I would tell you that Kenny Rogers wrote a song about this a long time ago, but you're too young to probably know, unless you're a Kenny Rogers groupie, you wouldn't know it. But he wrote a song about this. He said this guy's wife left him at such time that he had 400 children to crop in the field. I've always wondered what the next verse of that would be. I could take it out into the tax world, into the lease law world, and write a couple more verses to that. But that was not a fine time for her to die. Well, that's what happened here. Tenant died. Well, can the heirs come in and just assume the lease? And the court said, no, the lease died when the tenant died. And so the heirs are not entitled to come in and just continue that property and stay on there until they get notice of termination. Now, what they could do is come in and harvest that crop and retain whatever share their deceased family member was going to retain. But then they're out. They're not entitled to get notice of termination. So does everybody understand that? That's a key point. You just can't sit on it. You can clean up the existing crop that's there when your family member died, but you don't assume the lease. Once that crop's off the ground, that lease is over. Okay. Because the court reasoned the landlord contracted for the deceased tenant services only, and those services died with the tenant. And that's the rationale of the lease being a personal services contract. Okay. Now, that's not the outcome in every situation. Again, we need to try to avoid these problems with a written lease. Let's in Wilson against Field Grove in Nebraska. You had an oral cash lease, tenant dies. There's no statutory notice requirement in Nebraska. As I said earlier, it's common law. Common law, what the courts have said, add 6 months notice. Okay. So in this situation, the court distinguished between a cash lease and a sharecrop lease. And they said, well, and this is the correct way to look at this. If it's a cash lease, do I really care how good my tenant services are? Am I selecting the individual to farm my ground because I think they're a good farmer? Well, maybe, but not necessarily. I selected that tenant because I thought I could extract higher rent from them than I could somebody else. Okay. So in that instance, I don't care about their personal services. So it's not a personal services contract if it's a cash lease. But if it's a sharecrop lease where I'm sharing in the risk of production, risk of price change, yeah, then I kind of care how good my farming tenant is. So when the tenant under a sharecrop lease dies, then the lease dies with the tenant. But if it's a cash lease, they do not die when the tenant dies. Okay. Now, we have a lot of people out there, a lot of widow ladies in particular, that own the land in a life estate, for example. Because what happened when dad died, he said, to my wife for life. You might have the standard credit sheltered bypass trust, marital deduction trust. And so some of that property, some of that land's got to go to mom for life, remainder to the kids. We're doing that from an estate planning, tax planning standpoint. Okay. Mom leases the ground out. Mom doesn't own a fee simple interest in it. And then mama dies. Well, if mama owns a fee simple, if she owns the land outright, then what I said earlier still holds. Landlord's heirs just succeed to the landlord's share of the crop. But if mama just owns a life estate, and let's say mom's will said, well, we know the ground's going to go to the kids because that's the way it came from dad's estate. Said to my wife for life, remainder to the kids. Okay. Now, those kids, we could have different branches of the family that get into an argument here. Who gets the deceased landlord's share? If that goes into mom's estate, then mom can direct who gets that under the terms of her will. If it passes by the life estate feature, then it's going to go to whoever dad designated to get it after mom dies. Now, those two groups of people could be the same, but they could be extremely different. It could be different branches of the family, different sides of the same family. So what's the rule on this? Growing crops are generally held to be personal property. This is the rule in Kansas. That means the landlord's crop share. So mom had leased it out on a crop share. She's entitled to get her share of the crop. The land, the ownership interest goes, remainder interest to the kids of mom and dad. But maybe she said in her will, the other stuff that I have in my estate, it goes this direction, not to these people that get the remainder. I want it to go to other members of the family. Or I want it to go to my favorite ag economics professor in the Department of Ag Econ at K-State and at Washburn. That'd be the preferred way. We try to write a lot of wills that way. Growing crops in Kansas are generally held to be personal property. That means that crop share of mama is part of her estate. That's the Kansas approach. So then we read the will to see who gets that. All right. Colorado and Oregon go the other way. They said, no, it goes to the remainder holders. That's just a weird thing that's out there. A lot of people don't realize that one. That's something that needs to be addressed in a clause language in a good lease. What if one of the parties dies, landlord or tenant? Where do you want that property to go? What about responsibility of termination notice? What about responsibility for paying rent? Think that through, give that some thought. Just understand what the rule is if you don't do anything, where that's going to go. Controlling noxious weeds, as I said earlier, the duty is on the party that either owns or supervises the property. Well, the landowner owns it, the tenant supervises it. The tenant has possession. So both the tenant and the landlord are responsible. And ultimately, as I said, the bill is going to go, if the county controls the weeds, it's going to go to the landowner. And then you've got potential problem between the landowner and the tenant. That needs to be resolved. Now, the Kansas noxious weed statute was revised substantially 4 years ago. And there's more control in the counties to designate their own noxious weed list peculiar to that particular county. Okay, so that's a different topic for a different time. Permanent improvements, general rule is that permanent improvements belong to the landlord. So the question is whether the improvements become part of the real estate. Again, that's something we want to think through. We don't want to just use boilerplate language on that. We want to be able to clearly specify what is a permanent improvement and who gets it if the lease or when the lease terminates. Liability, what if a third party comes on the property and is injured on the premises? Well, normally liability is going to be attached to the party that's in possession and control. That's going to be the tenant. But the landlord can become liable if they reserve rights over a particular area and injury occurs in that area. They make a promise to fix something on the property. They didn't do it, and you got injury as a result of that. So that's another issue that's out there. Assignment. Tenant under Kansas law cannot assign or transfer the lease unless the landlord approves that. That makes the lease, if the tenant does that without permission, it makes it voidable. Not void. It doesn't wipe out the lease. It makes it voidable at the option of the landlord. And the landlord, under state law, can re-enter, take possession, and remove the tenant upon 10 days notice if they wish, if they want to do that. But you got to give notice. You got to give them 10 days notice on that. Sale of lease property, as I said earlier, normally the new owner takes the property subject to the existing lease. The tenant need not agree to be the tenant of the new owner. Said, look, I don't want to be your tenant. I give up my tenancy. Tenant can do that. If the tenant already paid rent, then they don't have to pay the new owner for the same time period. That's going to be a fact-based question as to how rent is being paid. Not everybody does it the same. Some will make 2 payments a year. Some, if it's crop share, it's going to come out of the crop at the time of harvest. They're all over the board on how those arrangements are. But the rule is, if you already paid rent for the particular time frame, then the land sells. You don't have to pay the new owner for that same time period. They'd be paying twice. And you don't have to do that. Now, the selling landlord can require the tenant to pay for any past due rent caused by the tenant's abandonment of the property before the sale. The tenant just says, oh, you're going to sell it? Okay, I'm out of here. No, you can make them pay for any past due rent before they are able to do that. Now, if rent is late 3 months, so at least 3 months, then the landlord can terminate the lease on 10 days written notice. So there's that 10-day written notice provision again, and the tenant might come clean and pay it all within 10 days. They have the right to do that. But any unpaid rent gives the landlord a lien on the crops that are growing or harvested from the leased premises. And that is a superior lien that is going to beat out any prior perfected security interest on the crops. And that attaches to the landlord's share of the crop. If we have a crop share lease, if it's a cash lease, landlord's going to have to file a Uniform Commercial Code document with the county to perfect that lien. Now, landlord has a right to possess the crop until the rent is paid. Landlord can hang on to that crop until the rent is paid. Okay. So leases normally would have to be in writing to be enforceable because they involve an interest in real estate. And that's one of the things you can see in the list there under the statute of frauds, which originated in 1677. They said real estate contracts have to be in writing to be enforceable. Now, the exception is certain leases. Now, what you're going to see, the next item down, the fourth bullet point down, says certain contracts have to be in writing to be enforceable. Contracts that cannot be performed within 1 year have to be in writing to be enforceable. That's why we have a rule in Kansas that says if the lease is oral, it's presumed to run March 1 to the end of February, March 1 to March 1. Okay, so performance can be rendered within a year, meaning it could be oral. So an oral farm lease can be valid because we presume it doesn't go for any more than a year. If it did, it would trip the statute of frauds, the Kansas version of the statute of frauds, which originates in the English Parliament back in 1677. Now, there are some things that might take the lease out of the statute of frauds. And one of those is that if you render part performance. So I had a discussion with my landlord. Based on that discussion, I think I'm going to get to lease the ground. So I go ahead and plant a crop. Okay. Well, that'll remove the lease from the statute of frauds requirements. So I changed position based on reasonably relying on what my landlord said. That's not going to be my problem. Same thing for promissory estoppel or detrimental reliance. Those are more fairness-based or equity-based type arguments. And if I go in and actually take possession of the premises, that might remove the statute of frauds requirement. Okay. So if I change position based on a reasonable reliance on what my landlord says, I'm going to be okay in most situations. Okay. But state law does control the termination of an oral ag lease. And that's going to differ from state to state. Colorado is different than Kansas, is different than Oklahoma, so forth and so on. And that can be dependent based on the state, based on types of crops, cropping seasons, and in some states, your notice of termination of a pasture lease has a different time frame to it than does your notice of termination of a crop lease. But that's not the case in Kansas. That used to be the case. Pasture leases were treated differently in terms of notice of termination than a crop lease. I helped rewrite that statute 30 years ago. So the pasture lease rules, same March 1 deadline applies to those. Okay. Now, how do you serve notice of termination if nothing is stated in a written lease? Well, it's best to send it by registered mail, return receipt requested, or certified mail. We want to do that. We want to have some type of receipt that indicates that it was delivered. Where at the tenant's usual place of business, but it could be left at the tenant's residence or by delivering a copy, this is the statutory language, to a person over age 12 who resides on the leased premises. Okay. So you can serve the notice of termination on the tenant's 13-year-old teenage daughter. Not sure I would recommend that. And if you can't find anybody over the age of 12 to give the written notice to, it says you can post it in a conspicuous place down at the post office. We had one case, Garrett against Garrett, he nailed it to the tenant's door of his residence. I wouldn't recommend that, but that's certainly conspicuous. Okay. Oil and gas leases. So let's shift out of the domain of crop leases here for just a bit. Oil and gas leases. Well, what I'm doing is I'm conveying the mineral interest by selling by virtue of the lease. So that's what I'm doing in that situation, by sale of the lease. So the oil and gas, while it's in the ground, is considered part of the real estate. And those rights can be conveyed by deed. But mineral interest can be severed from the surface. So I could sell the mineral interest separate than the surface interest. And if I don't make that reservation, when I sell the land, the presumption is that no severance has occurred and that the mineral rights go with the land. So you want to know what you're buying when you buy land. Now, a lot of landowners are going to prefer to retain ownership of the surface and lease the mineral rights out. Okay. Or you could sell the surface and retain the mineral rights. All right. So you just have to be aware of how the transaction is structured and what people are doing. Now, majority owners of mineral interest, the problem we get into with mineral interest is it's not very often that we have one person that owns the mineral rights. We got multiple people. These mineral rights are old. They've gone down through estates of family members over the years. And now you've got a whole bunch of people that own these retained mineral rights. The surface has changed hands numerous times. Well, what about a lease here? The majority owners of the mineral interest are protected if one or more of the holders of the minority interest become unknown. And we just simply don't know who these other people are. And this has gone down through many estates over the years. What happens is that your local district court appoints a receiver who can negotiate for the sale or the lease of the interest. Okay. And the other point here I want to make is if the person owns less than the outright fee interest in the real estate, they must usually join in executing an oil and gas lease. Okay. So that's another question that comes up that's unique to oil and gas leases. Who am I dealing with? Who's the party to the lease? Who are the owners of the mineral rights that have to agree to lease the property? Then you get into another issue where you could have multiple tenants. You could have a tenant, the crop tenant on the surface, then you could have the tenant on the minerals. So the crop tenant could conceivably recover damages from the landlord for damage to the tenant's crops or for interference with the tenant's use of the surface by the oil and gas operator. So what I'm saying here is I own a tract, let's say it's in western Kansas, it's got oil and gas. I lease the surface out to party A, I lease the mineral rights to party B. Well, party A, my crop tenant, could get damages from me because their crops were damaged or interfered with somehow because of what the oil and gas operator, the mineral interest owner, is doing. So what I want to do in my oil and gas lease is reserve the right to lease it for oil and gas, or I could have oil and gas lease made subordinate to the surface for drilling. If I grant that ag lease, that crop lease first, then the subsurface tenant might need to get the surface tenant's permission before they can drill. So we want to kind of think through those situations and what are the issues that can arise if I've got one party that is leasing the surface, another party that's leasing the subsurface. Where are my points that I'm going to have potential problem areas? And I want to think about that and draft something appropriately in a lease. Now, the lessee on an oil and gas lease, a mineral lease, typically has the right to enter the land and explore that land for minerals, meaning drill and begin production if it's discovered. So that includes the implied right to use as much of the surface as is reasonably necessary to exercise development rights. Lay pipelines, build roads, construct buildings. And so you might need additional contract language to restrict the location of the wells or structures. And you might want a provision requiring the landlord's approval concerning where the wells are going to be located, structures, and roads, so you can try to minimize interference issues with the ag tenant on the surface. Water use clauses, another one you're going to have in an oil and gas lease. Those provisions tend to be pretty broad. So the landowner might want to limit the use of the water by the operator. Okay, so we get into issues with respect to the water as a byproduct of oil and gas operations. Other contractual provisions in an oil and gas lease to think about: what surface damage clause? What protection do you need against damage to the surface? Well, I can tell you, without that clause, the lessee has no liability except for excessive use or negligence. Very hard to recover any types of damages in those situations unless you reserve something in a surface damage clause that's clear. Okay. You may want the clause requiring the tenant to restore the service to the original condition, and I think that's a good thing to do. All right. All right, pass on the rest of that. Let me show you this one, Kansas case 1987. Plaintiff buys land, has oil production on it, leased it to the defendant. Defendant buries a pipeline under the pasture, and in the process damages the pasture grass. Okay. And so the landowner wants to get compensated for that. So we've got a written lease. Here's what it says. Lessee shall bury his pipe below plow depth and promptly cover and level all pits, and lessee shall pay all damages caused by its operation to growing crops. And so they said, well, we want compensation for our pasture grass. The petroleum company said, wait a minute, your pasture is not a growing crop. So therefore, the damage provision clause doesn't apply. That's contemplating damage to crops, corn, soybeans, wheat, those type of things. You're not harvesting anything. That's pasture. So that damage clause doesn't mean anything. We read it out. And the court agreed. Yeah, it doesn't apply. There was no evidence offered to indicate the defendant in any way cultivated or worked the pasture so as to alter its natural growth. So a reference to plow depth in connection with growing crops only covers crops that result from planting, cultivation, and labor. It kind of makes sense when you think about it, but that's not what they intended to have happen. Guarantee that. Okay, we'll skip through the rest of that. You can take a look at those, but I need to keep moving along here. So numerous slides on oil and gas. I want to move on to the next one, wind energy. I could do a whole 4-hour seminar on this one. What are some of the basic provisions that you need in a wind energy lease? Okay. Well, what part of the land is subject to the agreement? Now, on these, particularly to my law students, what I tell them is if you're drafting a wind energy agreement for a client, or more likely you're trying to negotiate the bad terms out of a contract that has been provided to the client, be careful with your legal descriptions describing the land that's subject to the agreement. And you always want to think narrow. Define that land area as narrow as possible, as small as possible. If they just want an initial easement to come in and have access to the property to set up testing equipment and test whether this property is suitable for wind towers, then you want to define that pretty narrow. And if they say, well, we actually need more space to set up our equipment, our monitoring equipment, say, okay, I can expand that out, but for what? Well, for more compensation. But if I start big, I've lost all the negotiating power. So I need to start small and then expand for more money. That's the way to do that. And then you want to think about termination events. What events trigger early termination? Is there an automatic renewal clause? When do they have to commence construction? Is it within a couple of years? You don't want them to come in and just sit on the property. Say, you want to make a decision within a year or two. Compensation for land use restrictions, landowners' right to use the property, farm program complications, liability for action of third parties, just a whole host of things. Now, hunting leases. Again, as I said, landlord's going to have to reserve the right to hunt their own property if that's what they want to do. But hunting leases, I don't even like to call them leases. They're hunting agreements. It's more like a license. It's not a lease, but I'll call it a lease because that's what commonly we refer to it as. The key consideration is your liability sustained or caused by hunters on the property. Now, there are recreational use statutes, and Kansas has a recreational use statute, and hunting is a recreational use. And what those statutes do are significantly minimize the liability exposure to the landlord. Okay, but you have to meet the requirements of the statute. But as I said, a hunting lease is not really a lease. It's a license to use the property for hunting purposes. That's a contract right to use the property, which is defined by the parties. So get this in writing. Hunting leases or licenses to hunt the property should be in writing, period. And you can see the things there I'm talking about as to what you want in there. All right. That's a quick run through on Kansas lease law. I've left about 5 or 6 minutes for any questions that you have. And appreciate the invitation to be with you this evening. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. Not sure what I did. I just lost my slides. Did I lose the slides for you too?
Yeah, you
Brian?
did. Yes.
I did. What did I did?
I think you just went one slide too far. We can probably stop sharing our slides, and that'd bring you, I think, to full center right there.
Okay.
And
Well, the last slide had contact information on it. You got the slides. My Substack, which is mcgowanaglaw.tax.substack.com, has all types of technical information in it. That's a monthly publication for primarily lawyers and CPAs. But I get into stuff like Farm Bill and what Robin was talking about, first of all. I get into all those types of things. I am in the process. I will be sending a letter. I'll just let those of you know on. I'll be sending a letter next week to both of the Kansas senators and to Senator Grassley in Iowa as to what we would like done in a farm bill. I'm up to 9 things right now. And I'm talking about different statutory language things that want to be fixed. I'll do a webinar on this tomorrow for the Kansas City Agribusiness Council. Then I'll formulate that into a letter. One of the things is we need to fix the equipment gain issue, where that income from the sale of equipment will count as farm income for purposes of that 75% test that was talked about earlier. That currently is not the FSA position on that, and they will not change. We've been pressing hard on. There's a group about 3 or 4 of us that press hard on that, and so that's going to have to be changed by legislation. So it's kind of technical things like that. I'm up to 9 that I'm going to suggest to our senators and to Senator Grassley. Okay.
I do have a few questions that came through the chat for you, Roger. They go all the way back to, does the DCP 172 apply to cow-calf pair minimum guaranteed leases, or does it tie it to the number of pairs that are there?
Yeah, that was not issued with livestock in mind, although I think the same reasoning would apply to livestock. So what they're basically saying there is you can flex it whatever way you want, and that's not going to kick it into a cash lease, which would disqualify you for payments. I'm pretty certain of that.
Okay. The next one I had was liability issues as it relates to hunting. So if I'm wanting to retain my hunting rights, what kind of liability does that put on the landowner at that point?
If I'm retaining the hunting rights?
Yeah.
Give me a situation as to what you're thinking.
Well, I'm just reading from the chat. I think in regards, if somebody got injured on the property and you retain the hunting rights for that property, I mean,
okay.
Would the landlord have to have just liability insurance, or
Yeah.
who carries that insurance then?
Well,
And if it's not a true question, please put that in the chat.
Yeah, that's a
Something.
good question. We want both the landlord and the tenant to carry insurance. They both have an insurable interest. The tenant has possession, is normally responsible for those things. But if we have a written lease, the landlord retaining the hunting rights and then allowing a third party to come on the property, in addition to, the tenant has possession, but here I am, I retain the hunting rights. That means I can have somebody else come on the property and hunt it if I want because I retain those rights. In that situation, I would have responsibility if there is a problem. And I would be responsible if there's a problem that's caused to the tenant's property, that's on my property because they have possession to it. So I need to have insurance coverage to cover that. But we still want the tenant to have insurance coverage also, for things that they might do that cause injury to themselves or others during their possessory time that they would be responsible for.
And another question I seen pop up, wind rights, are they treated like mineral rights or are they going to be treated totally separate? I think you started to cover that, but I guess it was asked, I want to verify that.
Yeah, they are in Kansas. They're treated like mineral rights, and we can convey them separately from the land.
Okay. I think maybe the hunting lease question, it might have been, the leases are tied to hunting seasons, as in we go from end of turkey to the beginning
Yep.
of archery season by written lease.
Yes.
They are responsible for fencing and will retain ownership of fixtures added
Yeah.
for purposes of hunting.
Yeah,
Okay.
we can do all of that in a written lease.
Okay.
You're not tied to March 1. March 1, that doesn't make sense with respect to a hunting lease. And that's why we need to have these reduced to writing in a separate agreement. And because they have to be specially tailored.
I guess I will offer anybody else if you want to unmute and ask a question to Roger. I think I've went through the only other thing the snow picture from the beginning that was from 1976, 77.
Yeah, that's when I was still at home on the farm in Indiana. What was it was a blast when you were a kid. You didn't have school for 6 weeks, and I built a 2-story igloo with stairs in it. I had all time every day just to play in the snow and dig tunnels to get out to the barn. I remember digging tunnels to get to our cow barn, and the snow was probably 8 feet high on both sides, and you just tunneled your way out to the barn.
Ryan,
Yeah.
I've got a question.
Yes.
What's the longest a landlord could set a lease up to a tenant for to be viable? I mean, can you set it up for 1 year, 5 years, 10 years? And do you need to record it at the register of deeds, and will it be honored if the land changes hands or if somebody dies?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, that's governed by state law that differs from state to state. In Iowa, for example, you can't go longer than 5 years. We don't have a statute like that in Kansas. My suggestion is anything longer than a year, make sure you record it in the county on the land records, because there's so many things that can happen. The longer you get in the term of that lease, you could have somebody that dies, the land changes hands by either as a result of death or as a result of sale. You could have a third party come onto the property, you could, such as a subsurface tenant. You could have an energy company that you're dealing with, and so we really need to have that recorded so that these other parties can check the record to just make sure everything's straight. We know who we're dealing with and that whether there's a tenant out there or not. My suggestion on leases in general is that we don't go longer than a year, and then we renegotiate them every year. So I want a series of 1 year, even if we're going to just do it 1 year at a time, put it in writing, and then say that it's got to terminate. However, in a separate agreement, perhaps, or we can put the language in the lease agreement itself. The parties hereby agree to, say, by December 1, to start negotiations for the next year.
Okay, so does that need to be done by an attorney, or can an individual drop the lease and take it to the register of deeds themselves?
Well, I would suggest having an attorney that is well versed in these real estate issues take a look at it. You can put something together for them to look at, but it's like that question I got today, and that was, notice determined it has to be given within 30 days of January 1. Well, it's that type of mistake that I would sure hope an attorney wouldn't make and would spot that, saying, now, wait a minute, you can, what does that mean? You can give notice on January 23 to cut somebody off the previous January 1. That's what it says. That's not what they meant. I understand that. But my point is words and phrases in the context can mean different things if it's not worded very carefully. That's why the language gets so difficult, because you're trying to cover your bases. So I would suggest, if you want to write something out, write it out, then take it to an attorney that deals with property law issues and ag leases.
Thank you, Roger. I did have another one pop up. How does recreational use for no compensation apply to Kansas law as a landowner? The recreational use for no compensation liability is in UTV or horseback riding, etc.
And those would be recreational uses covered by the statute. And what it does is say that you're not liable for that person's injury that's participating in a recreational event on your property unless you acted willfully or wantonly in injuring them, or knowingly provided them faulty tack if it's horse riding, or a UTV that you knew was not safely operable, those types of things. But the other party would have to show that you knew those things. But what it does is really minimize your liability risk. And actually, as a farmer, you could even receive compensation and still get the protection of the statute. Now, if you're a non-farmer, you can't. But if you're a farmer, you can.
Anybody else got any questions before we try to wrap this up? Oh, they asked to continue to expand on that.
Sorry, if I may
okay.
interject a little bit. I represent a sizable portion of property in the eastern part of the state, and we get asked to host events. We have a significant number of, operable trails, etc. Beautiful landscape from charitable organizations like the Lions Club, Rotary Club, Horseback Riding Club, etc. And there's always the perception of liability if someone gets hurt. And we've been advised that if we are not accepting compensation on the property, that our liability is minimized. They took the responsibility on their own. We've even been given what I feel are kind of half-hearted notices to post. If you ride your horse here and kill yourself, it's your problem, etc. Just like a little more expansion on this particular time. I think a lot of farmers get asked if they, there's no recreational land in the state of Kansas, and people are always looking for a place to go hang out. And
sure,
you don't want to be a jerk, but you also don't want to get sued because somebody's, not smart.
No, that you're right. That's the way the recreational use statute works. And what I said earlier was we've got a special provision in the Kansas version. Every state has a recreational use statute, but our version says that a farmer still gets the protection of the statute, meaning much reduced liability exposure, even if they charge a fee. Now, clearly, if you don't charge a fee, you have the protection of the statute. But our statute says even if you charge a fee, if it involves farm ground, then you get the protection of the statute, meaning it reduces your liability risk. And so that's a unique aspect of our statute. Now, I'll tell you this, that portion of the statute's never been tested in court. I don't think I'd want to be the first test case on that, because I could see a court saying, well, you're financially benefiting from this, so you should bear the risk. But the way the legislature drafted, they said, no, we're going to let farmers charge fees and still give them the protection of the statute. But if you're a non-farmer, no, you can't.
Are there any other questions?
Oh, I know, Ryan, the one other thing I want to add to that, if it's a horse activity, then we got another layer of rules that come into play, signage and tack and those types of things, because we have a horse act that can come into play, an equine safety act, or an equine whatever it's called, equine recreational activity act, and that requires signage and those types of things. So if it's horses, then we get into a different issue.
If you have one of those equine signs, does it cover you then? I mean, the equine, we're not responsible for personal
If
injury?
you use the language that the state specifies, yes.
Well, I don't have any other.
And there's no sign like that that relates to motorcycles or UTVs or four-wheelers?
No, we have a specific statute that's an equine statute for equine activities, but not for ATVs and those types of things. That would be under the general recreational use statute.
All right. I think that's all. I do want to say thank you to Roger, Megan, Robin, I think already had to hop off, but I want to thank you guys for your time this evening. I've really appreciated it. Did you have a question, sir?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
did. We went through the cash rental rates there, but we didn't actually establish an amount for cow-calf operations like here in eastern Kansas. What can a renter or a landowner expect to get?
Megan, so if you're on, I guess I'm going to ask you to come back in maybe to help answer this question. While maybe I'm waiting on Megan, it looks like she hasn't turned her camera back on. I think there are, so what she shared tonight was in terms of just pasture rent per acre. I think
For cow-calf.
well, that would, yeah, I mean, for cow calf, I don't know if how hay ground falls into that.
Well, you
As
allow
well,
4 acres per cow, so a person can figure from there.
And the Blue Stem Pasture Report is a K-State survey as well, and it covers mostly the Flint Hills on native grass, but they do actually establish it's this amount, or this is what the amount says from the survey of what's getting charged. But I don't know if they have an amount. Megan, do you have an amount, or do you know of an amount that for cow-calf operations?
I do not off the top of my head, but if you'd like to shoot me an email, my contact information was on my slides, which I will send over to Ryan to share with all of you, and I can get to work to get you a better answer.
And I can look at that a little bit closer too and try to get back with you.
Well, it seemed like 10 years ago, rent was about $125 cow-calf pair. Calves were worth $500 coming off the cow. Well, then about 5 years ago, they went up to $1,000 coming off the cow. Well, last year was $1,500.
Yep.
So somehow it looks like the rent they pay should be going up, equivalently.
With while it looks that way, I will also say on the flip side of that, fertilizer prices, their input costs go up as well. But like I said, I can look at that a little bit closer and get you an answer, pulling from those different surveys and reports. But I as of right now, I don't have that in front of me. So.
Well, and then hay ground,
Mhm.
a big bale was going for $20 a bale, say 10 years ago. And now it's up to, well, the average out here at the sale was $70.
Yep.
So it looks like
And that's down from last year when it was really expensive. I mean, over $100. So.
well, maybe I missed that sale.
Yeah,
But,
last year was.
looks like hay ground should go up a little bit too.
Yeah. Hey, Megan, in terms of the NAS, does hay ground get incorporated into the pasture, or is it incorporated into the crop ground? Do you know the answer to that and how that figure is figured?
I think they're in the pasture, but I'm not 100% sure on that.
So again, if Anderson County didn't have a NAS pasture survey, but I think last year it was like $29 an acre, is what they were saying it was worth. I guess, yeah. I mean, you look at it in terms of it'd be cheaper to rent ground than it is to buy the hay, but you got to afford then the tractor and machinery to put it up as well. So, it's a big balancing act there, but
I guess those are the two questions
yeah.
I had coming in tonight.
Okay. And I'll work hard with you, sir, and try to get those figured out for you. So,
Okay, thank you.
are there any other questions before we wrap this up? All right. Well, thank you guys all for staying. I know we're just a little after 8. So anyways, I greatly appreciate it. And if you guys have questions, please don't hesitate to give me a call and I can get in touch with any of our presenters, or I think they did share their information in their slides, which I'll be sharing with you guys all via the email address that you got the Zoom link from. I'll also attach a survey to that. Please, if you would, fill that out and send it back to me. I'd greatly appreciate it. So with that, thank you guys very much, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Ryan. Bye now.